My name's Jane Scott, and I'm President and CEO of the Columbus Metropolitan Club. And if we look a little, my staff and I look a little weary. This is the second event this week, so we love having our guests here in Columbus and here with us at the Boathouse. Today's forum is sponsored by the Dispatch Media Group and presented in partnership with the Greater Columbus Sister Cities International, the Columbus Council on World Affairs, and the Federation of Indian Associations. Won't you please help me and thank them and welcome Nikhil Hunchakati, VP of Marketing for the Dispatch Media Group, to the stage to introduce our forum.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you, friends. I'm honored to be here today. Dispatch Media Group is proud to support the Columbus Metropolitan Club. Civil conversations each week at CMC are important to our community, and they help set the tone for moving us forward together as friends and neighbors. Today, we are honored to host an important ally and friend to our community on a global scale. In Central Ohio, more H-1B visa workers come from India than all other countries combined. I can tell you that I was one of those statistics not too far back from today. The Federation of Indian Associations has a tradition of inviting dignitaries from India to visit Columbus, including the current and many past embassy officials and ambassadors. The exchange of ideas around cultural congruence, business synergies, as well as immigration have been mutually beneficial for both India and the United States. And we hope that these bonds will continue to grow and nurture new ones. Today, our esteemed guest will make opening remarks and then join Mr. Patrick Terrian, President and CEO of the Columbus Council for World Affairs, for a conversation, followed by audience questions. Without further ado, please join me in providing a warm welcome for His Excellency, Mr. Navtej Sarna, Ambassador of India to these United States.
Thank you very much. May I thank, first of all, the hosts, the Metropolitan Club, Dispatch Media, the FIA, and the World Affairs Council for enabling this to happen in such a magnificent setting. It's really wonderful to be here. It's my first visit, and as Nikhil asked me, how many times do I plan to visit Columbus? And I said, now that, I've been here once, now the sky is the limit. I could come here very often. It's a great combination of work and pleasure. And it seems like a great place to be, which is, I'm not surprised that you have 50,000 people of Indian origin, I understand, working here, the largest representatives of the H-1B community happen to be here. I know this is meant to be a conversation. I think that's how it's been pitched, and that's how it should stay. It should not become a monologue. So I'm not going to speak for very long. I would just tell you that it's a very exciting moment to be representing India in the United States. I deem it a particular privilege and an honor for several reasons. One, the India story has improved dramatically in the last few years. And you can take any cutoff point. Perhaps you can take the 1991 beginning of the liberalization of the Indian economy and carry it through, and in the particularly the last 3 years of the Modi government, the amount of transformational economic reforms that have been accelerated and implemented. Many of you would have heard about the demonetization, which came in the news a lot last year, or the goods and services tax, which once it gets over its teething problems, as it is now doing, will really improve the ease of doing business in India, something which I know is of great interest to people in the United States. And India's economy today is something which is causing a lot of, is generating a lot of interest, a lot of movement all over the world. We are one of the few economies which is growing at 7.2%, perhaps the only one. We have great predictions for the coming years. We're going to have a $500 million in the so-called middle class by 2025, which shows the kind of purchasing power that India is going to have. We are a huge market and a destination for investment. We are today the largest FDI, foreign direct investment destination in the world. And if you look at India's plans to revamp its infrastructure, then that itself opens up huge number of opportunities for foreign investors, whether it's roads, railways, ports, airports, inland waterways, and so on and so forth. The whole digital space is expanding very, very quickly. The entire cybersecurity is something which we are beginning to work very much in. The startup India is something also which is very exciting. Last year in November, we hosted, along with the United States, the Global Entrepreneur Summit, in which the focus was on startups. And I cannot begin to describe to you the excitement in that forum in Hyderabad, when you had literally thousands of young people with ideas, presentations, plans in every corner of the space, wanting to project these ideas. And most interestingly for me, I think India is today one of the youngest countries. So you have, at one estimate, about 800 million people under the age of 35. So that's a huge amount of energy there, aspirational, hungry, I mean it in a good sense, wanting to do things, wanting to improve their position in life, wanting to get further. So it's a great moment to be representing India. It's a great moment to be in the United States because of the 20-year steady growth in India-US relations. As was being mentioned, and I mentioned it last night somewhere in a speech in Washington just earlier this week, the subject of the speech was how India moved from being estranged democracies to natural allies. And I mentioned that estranged is normally a word that you use for spouses. So that presupposes a certain love and affection, which may have gone into cold storage for a while, but comes back if you create the right circumstances, a candlelit dinner, and so on and so forth. So I think what has happened is that over the last 2 decades, the right mood has been created, and we've forgotten the days of our episodic up and down relationship when we happen to be on different sides of global issues because of Cold War realities, because of frozen mindsets. But we did have at all times a common democratic background, a common democratic mindset. We were familiar with each other's institutions. We knew how a diverse society lives, thinks, the problems of such a society. And that sort of bonding, I think, has now really come into its own when the right amount of effort has gone into it. Along with that is a political, strategic, parallel view of the world, an increasingly increasing sympathy to each other's concerns, and of course a huge potential in the economic sphere to make both countries grow together, and not at each other's expense, but together. And I must say, and I'll end with this, I think one of the pillars of this progress has been the Indian American community, which is so well represented here in Columbus, which has, it's difficult to estimate how much has contributed to the respect, to the awareness of India by their work, not only in the economic field, not only in hospitals, but also increasingly in the political arena. And today you have 4 congressmen and women and 1 senator of Indian origin in Washington, D.C. And you have a large number of mayors and other officials in different councils and different assemblies all over the United States. So that mainstreaming has been very important in creating better bonds between India and the United States. So may I end here and we can carry this on? Thank you.
Great, great. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you for the marriage advice, too. Don't have candlelight, but hopefully we can start that process here. I wanted to ask you, so you get a call from the president, our president here in the U.S., and he says, Ambassador Sarna, come to the White House. I want to hear what's on your mind. What are the top 3 or 4 things that India thinks about and wants the U.S. to know? What are some of the things that would be on your list?
Well, some of it I already said, but it's so nice of you to think that such a phone call can happen.
Maybe it's a tweet.
So if such a phone call were to happen, I think I would be happy to quickly put together 3 or 4 main issues that India has. And I don't mean issues in a bad sense, but in the sense it's very important to consistently underline the logic that drives India-US relations. And I think I would be very happy to say that, look, here is a country which is 1.3 billion people and growing. Here is a country which works very much like the United States. We have states and we have chief ministers like you have governors and so on. Here's a country which peacefully changes its government whenever it wants to through the electoral process, a process which is respected across the world. And here is a country which provides you with not just a market. Of course, it's a huge market, but here's a country which can be your economic partner as you try to grow the United States, whether it is that you want technical professionals, people who can make your companies globally competitive, which has been the case here, incidentally. I mean, our H-1B visa holders are employed more by American companies than by Indian IT companies. So the major part of our professionals goes to make the United States globally competitive. Whether you need, here is a country which is increasingly understanding the strategic defense potential of the India-US engagement, which is today conducting more military exercises with the United States than with any other country. And if you're bothered, Mr. President, about what is happening in the Indo-Pacific, if you want to create a zone of peace and prosperity and progress in the Indo-Pacific, if you want to give the countries of Indo-Pacific alternative methods of building their infrastructure in a transparent way, if you want to establish the rules of international law, the freedom of the seas, the freedom of overflights, the freedom for our trade and energy to flow in the Indo-Pacific, then frankly, you can't find a better partner than India.
Sounds very reasonable.
So when's the phone call?
Let me just check Twitter, see if there's any international incidents happening as we meet. Let's dive in a little bit to the economic side, because your Prime Minister has promoted this Make in India initiative, and recently in an interview you mentioned that this actually complements President Trump's economic and foreign policy of America First. So can you talk a little bit about how Make It in India and America First are complementary?
Well, you know, it's on the face of it, it seems like a contradiction. How can you be making two countries first? Well, that's the beauty of international relations and diplomacy and international trade, that you actually can. I mean, what does America First mean? That, okay, you want to manufacture in America, and you want to create American jobs, and you want to make American companies profitable and competitive. If the Make in India takes off, for instance, we can help make things in India and supply them to the United States as part of a global chain. I know, for instance, that Lockheed Martin is making a part, I think it's of the C-17, in India. And they're making the plane in the United States, but they feel comfortable enough to get this part of the fuselage made in India and brought here. And nobody sees that as contradictory. And incidentally, if the Make in India takes off, the Indian companies are not going to just keep making in India. For instance, you have some of the biggest Indian producers. They make in India, and then they take that production capacity and set up factories all around the world. I know Mahindra has recently opened a factory in Detroit, if I'm not wrong. They are now producing in the United States a very successful SUV. At that time doesn't mean that they've shut down their production capacities in India, but some of the research and development that they are able to do there, they can bring across, which results in jobs here. You know, a recent report brought out that India has invested $18 billion over different states. You created more than 110,000 jobs in different states by Indian companies. Mm-hmm. So I think there is, and another aspect, you know, if there is Make in India, it's not that we are going to sell it back to the United States. So which would take away from some of the things. Okay, you know, we want to make Ford in India and send it back to the United States. We're not doing that. But if you want to sell something, say, to Malaysia, and you make it in India, along with an Indian partner, and then both of you go and sell it in Malaysia, I think there's a win-win for everybody concerned. So there are ways of skinning this cat.
Yeah. I think about, and this, I'm not an economist, but when I think about Make in India, requires you to have talent in India. And right now, a lot of talent is also supporting the U.S. Economy, mostly digitally, but also through the H-1Bs. And we have this concern in Columbus and sometimes broader in Ohio about brain drain. So, you know, we have all these educated people that we bring up and then they go elsewhere. Is that on the minds of leaders in India as they think about the role India plays in the talent pool for the world?
Well, Patrick, we used to think like that in the 60s. So when you grow up, you'll start thinking like
I'll start. Well, I know what else was happening in the 60s, so I mean.
We used to get very worried when our engineers and doctors left our shores and went away to the United States for greener pastures. And, you know, there were all sorts of heartburn and angst. But frankly, what's happened is that we have produced a lot of professionals. Our professional institutions have been very, very prolific. And I think a lot of people also stay back. The second thing is that a lot of people are going back, looking for jobs. I think that transferability with the opening of the Indian economy has increased a lot. So now it's seen more as a kind of a symbiotic link rather than a cutoff that you've gone, sort of. And now, for instance, that brain drain that happened, that same brain drain is helping create wealth in India also. Whether they're setting up companies, they're setting up startups, they're helping startups, they're doing things in the Silicon Valley which is actually benefiting India. So I think, it used to be said brain drain has become brain gain. So what we could not have gained by keeping all these people inside India with the limited economic opportunities that we had in the 60s and 70s, we may have gained by letting them go and flourish and opening up our economy and growing that at the same time. So now in a globalized world, I think whether you are sitting on the west coast of the United States or you're sitting in Bangalore makes that much less of a difference. Yeah. And I think the awareness that they have created for India, for instance, yesterday I had a meeting with the chairman of Dell Computers, and he said that our second home is India. After the United States, the biggest representation that Dell has, whether it is production or service, is in India. So there, I think, again, they've been guided a lot by the people who, from Indian origin, who are really doing so much of their work here. So I think it's become a far more comfortable relationship.
My understanding from some research that I did was that India will surpass China as the largest, most populous country in the world within about 10 years. And being a highly educated population, that seems to be a good thing in terms of talent. So I think about education. That's a lot of education. Do you feel like, or do you know that the Indian education system has what's needed to educate enough people to support programs, like the Make It in India initiative, supporting, not, because I would imagine, in addition to the US, there's other countries that utilize India as an outsourcing hub as well. So can you talk a little bit about the education system and what India is doing strategically to make sure that it can supply that level of talent that's needed?
Well, I think we've traditionally had a good educational system, but you're absolutely right. The needs and the challenges for our education system are consistently growing, and they're huge. I know that there is a major effort, which the Prime Minister has started, to create several world-class universities in India through partnership with foreign universities. I know a lot of universities from abroad are going and opening branches and offices in India. Also, we were mostly a state-run university system in the early years, but now you have some very high-quality private universities coming up. At the same time, I think this is a huge challenge, whether it's in terms of schooling, and also we are moving very quickly to a skilling platform. So after school, everybody doesn't have to do a graduate degree. So you're creating platforms and institutions which can provide people with skills of a technical nature, so which can create those jobs which necessarily don't have to be all white-collar jobs. So I think there's a variety of initiatives, but I'm the first one to say that it's a huge challenge.
Let's switch and think about, it's not always about, other countries aren't always thinking about America as much as maybe we think they are. So say your Prime Minister says, Ambassador, we now need you to be ambassador in China. You're going to be in Beijing. And Xi Jinping calls you and says, Ambassador Sarna,
this is my good day today.
I I heard that you recently met with President Trump, and I'd like to have a conversation with you. What are some of the concerns India has? What do you want me to be aware of from India's perspective about India-China relations?
Well, you know, it's, yes, let's write some science fiction. Yeah.
You are an author, I know, right?
Well, I think the fact is that there you have two huge countries next to each other. You have two countries with a very different political system. You have two countries with a very different way of running their economies. And you have two countries which have had some history of conflict and an unresolved border issue. And yet you have two countries who, even if they don't say so themselves, are seen by the world as, you know, they must be competing. So I think if there was that sort of an opportunity, it would be a great thing to look not at immediate problems or immediate issues or incidents, but as a broad sweep of how you're going to develop. I think the big concern is how are these two countries going to develop in the coming years? How are they going to handle issues of population, health, education, economy, environment? How are they going to handle issues of competing global interests or regional interests in the Indo-Pacific, for instance? How are they going to make sure that there is a good understanding between them so that there are less misunderstandings and less chance of conflict? And ultimately, how can they use their huge resources, whether it be material resources or people's resources, to actually help the rest of the world? And I think how they can, I would be worried about how we can be talking to each other and increasing the people-to-people links. For instance, I know some Indian films are extremely popular in China. They've done better in China than in India. So I think how much of a bond that can create. Interestingly, things which you'd never associate with this kind of conversation could be, how can we use our traditional spirituality of a different kind in both countries to actually strengthen these people-to-people bonds? So there is a question of trade, there's a question of tradition, there's a question of playing to each other's strength. So I think that conversation would be primarily aimed at creating a better long-term understanding.
Sounds like you'd be very successful at doing that. Maybe we can switch to, I'm curious about utilizing the opportunity of you being here to talk a lot about the diversity within India. You know, we have in our community, India is the largest country of origin for immigrants here in Columbus. But we may not ask questions about culture or learn a lot about the variety just by the folks that are here. Can you talk a little bit about India and its diversity in all its forms, including ethnic, religious, et cetera, linguistic? Help us understand India. It's a big place, and I know it's complex.
Well, it is a big place, and there used to be very prominent personalities in the world when we became independent. I think it was also Winston Churchill, who felt that India could really not exist as a country once they were left on their own. They would break up. There would be a lot of vociferous tendencies. People would be fighting over language or religion or so on and so forth. I think all that essentially goes against the very concept of India as a nation. Because I think it's interesting to know that when the British actually left, we were just not one country, and I'm not talking of the partition of Pakistan, that's a separate thing. But within India itself, as India as it is today, there were some 560 odd independent kings, Maharajas, who, if they wanted, each one of them could have said that, sorry, I'm my own country. The fact that that didn't happen underlines that there is a certain binding thread within the country. Despite the fact that you probably have more diversity going from North India to South India than you would have coming from India to Europe. More diversity in food, more diversity in ethnic backgrounds, more diversity in language. Every major religion in the world, I think 4 of the world's biggest religions born in India. So I think diversity is India. That's a strength, not something which pulls us down. And that's what we thrive on. Fortunately, we have a constitution which was built to handle diversity. It recognizes, I always forget this figure, is it 18 and now the languages in the constitution? No, not the official, as recognized languages. And there are thousands of dialects.
Well, you yourself speak, tell us.
Well, my mother tongue is Punjabi. I speak Hindi, I speak English. Yeah. So that's at least, most Indians are trilingual. Yeah. So you have that to begin with. So that can take us, to different parts, such as, I remember traveling 35 years ago in extreme northeast of India, and we had lost our way. And we were at the back of a truck as youngsters, and we had lost our way. The driver had lost his way, and we suddenly found 2 boys sitting in shorts. They had obviously been hunting pigeons, and they were roasting a pigeon on a fire, which they had lit. And I said, okay, let me go and ask them. And I went and I asked them, and I tried to make gestures, and I said, this place, and I said the name of the place, and I tried to communicate by sign language, because my presumption was that they would not understand me. And they kept doing the same thing to me, until one of them turned around and said, do you speak English? So,
Yeah, sure. I think assumptions can get the best of us sometimes with cultures. And I want to encourage folks to think about their questions and begin lining up where, Andy? Right here. We're going to open up here in another minute. Speaking of that, I wanted to ask about religious diversity. So many of the Indians that I've met here in Columbus are Hindu. And I'm curious, can you talk a little bit about it? And if you're willing to share your own religious practice, we'd love to hear it.
Well, I'm a Sikh, very obviously. And I think Sikhs are now well known all around the world. We are a relatively small community, a very young religion, about, I would say, 550 years old religion. And it's a small community of possibly 22 million within India, and about that, or slightly less abroad. And it's a religion which began in North India, and it was in many ways a reform religion. And I think we've always sort of punched above our weight in terms of visibility, because maybe it's the physical appearance that makes it seem so. But yes, I think we have contributed as a young religion, a lot to India's diversity.
Got it. Great, thank you. I want to open up the floor for questions. We've cast the audience spellbound. Thank you, sir. Go ahead.
Yes, my name is John McKnight. Aside from the, trade negotiations or difficulties or whatever might have come out of the current administration in Washington, has this current administration made doing business in the United States or even living in the United States harder for people from India? It seems that the Washington administration has made it a little more acceptable to be racially biased and discriminatory and things like that. Have you found that to have an effect on the ability to work and live and trade and do business and everything in the United States?
Thank you.
Well, honestly, I think that's a question which people in the audience should answer. People who actually live here and who are American citizens of foreign birth. I think they would be better equipped to say that. What I can speak to there is that, yes, as far as we are concerned at the embassy, there have been concerns expressed about what will happen to the H-1B visas. Will they be cut out? Will they be stopped? And so we've been sort of trying to study those issues. I understand so far the H-1B visas are being overfulfilled as they were in the past. And I think it's what we have been able to project is that abuse of H-1B visa is not in anybody's interest. And obviously, that's something which the government will take a view on, and is maybe that's what you're referring to. At the same time, what we have been trying to highlight is the contribution of the H-1B visa holders to the US economy. So in that sense, to create an understanding, a distinction of the professionally qualified immigrants who have come under the H-1B visa to work and their contribution to the US economy as against people who may be illegal immigrants. So I think, our job is more in terms of clarification, education, but I think the practical day-to-day living is something which you will have to address, perhaps the FIA here, and they may be able to give you their honest responses.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for being here today. My question stems around the strategic point of the visit, of you being here in Central Ohio. What is the discussion that's happening in chambers of commerce across India about the strategicness of having presence in Central Ohio, or maybe even in the greater state of Ohio specifically, and maybe contributing to the renaissance of our Rust Belt? Are there investment opportunities that you're seeing? What is the strategy that goes behind your visit, your office's activities in this region? If you can characterize that for us as a community of business people and business leaders, so we can kind of start to understand where that conversation begins.
Well, I think each of these visits sort of adds to this canvas of understanding. Each one of these visits, one goes back with a new insights. So I think it's been traditional. There's no great grand strategy in my visit, except that it's been traditional for most ambassadors to come to Columbus. Consul General here from New York is here, and he has very good contacts with the FIA and other prominent people. So I think this meeting, last evening I had a meeting with all the Indian associations, and in a similar gathering, people, representatives from, and they have their concerns. So it's a question of engagement with these associations and the community, so that we understand their problems, and also we understand and appreciate the amount of contribution they have made. I think in terms of investments, all the Indian chambers of commerce are now well represented in Washington. They hold frequent road shows for visiting Indian states. They hold a lot of investor summits in different parts of the United States. For instance, the chief minister of one of our largest states, Maharashtra, is expected to be here in mid-June. We've had several chief minister visits in the last 6 months, and the state chief ministers are now competing with each other for investments in their states. So that is another thing. So they no longer depend only on the center trying to push foreign investment into India, but they reach out and they come here and they meet investors and they do road shows. The new state of Telangana, for instance, extremely aggressive in trying to get investments. So I think all that sort of falls into place. That's how, given the sort of conditions available, given the economic attractions of a particular place, I think the Indian companies are setting up industry, as I mentioned, and are cooperating and finding partners. So I think all that sort of goes into the mix.
Great, thank you. I'm getting the sign that if you can stay a few more minutes, we can ask these last two questions.
Ambassador, thanks for being in Columbus, in Ohio, and specifically here at the CMC luncheon. My name's Tim Sword. I'm the president, of Greater Columbus Sister Cities International. One of our 10 sister cities is Ahmedabad, India. And I was wondering if you could help me sell how you see citizen diplomacy linking Columbus, Central Ohio to that region of Ahmedabad in India, where you see maybe potential connections could be.
Thank you.
What was the question?
We have a sister city in India.
Ahmedabad,
yeah. Could you help sell the importance of people-to-people diplomacy?
I think you can't overrate people-to-people diplomacy. It's really a very important part. And I think the setting up of the sister city of Ahmedabad is a very important aspect of this. I don't know how active this relationship has been, but I would encourage you to make it actually interactive in terms of exchange of delegations, exchange of not just tourists, but an exchange of chambers of commerce, exchange of academics. I know the huge sort of the university system that you have here and how useful that can be. But I think the people-to-people relationship goes beyond simply a city-to-city relationship. So I think I would encourage you as a city to be in close touch with our consulate in New York so they can direct more traffic to Columbus on matters of interest, which could be benefiting both the cities.
Great. Thank you. Last question.
Mr. Ambassador, John Torres with the Ohio Corn and Wheat Growers Association. Earlier you talked about how food is a fundamental thing that binds people to people. You also talked about how the very young population of India is very hungry, and I'm sure literally as well as figuratively. There's a lot of farmers here in Ohio that grow food who rely on exports to various parts of the world. When President Trump gives you that phone call and he says, Mr. Ambassador, we would like to talk about building a new bilateral trade agreement with the country of India. What is that discussion like around all sorts of different products, including food and agricultural commodities?
And you have 30 seconds to do that.
Well, I didn't fully get your question, but if we are talking of the potential of export of food to India, I think there would be still some items which we buy, particularly, but basic food grains India has been self-sufficient in for a while. So I think there is specialized agricultural export, for instance, of almonds. 85% of India's almond market is with Californian producers. So I think you have to find the right thing that India needs and get it across there.
Great. And before I turn it over to Jane to close the program out, I want you to know how much of a Renaissance man he is. Not only is he a foreign policy expert and diplomat, he's also an author. Several books on Sikhism, but the one that maybe you can come back to Columbus and talk about next is in 2003, We Weren't Lovers Like That, a fiction novel about a 40-year-old man whose wife has just left him and the possibility of reconnecting with a long-lost love. Who knew you had such breadth? Say that, wait.
That's all right.
I'd like to pass it over to Jane to close today's program.
Thank you. Thank you, Patrick. And I hope you all have enjoyed this fascinating conversation as much as I have. We hope you'll stick around. There's coffee and cookies in the back. Please continue the conversation and socialize and enjoy the company here. And before we leave, let's thank our sponsors and our partners, the Dispatch Media Group, the Greater Columbus Sister Cities International, Columbus Council on World Affairs, Federation for Indian Associations, and please join me in thanking our speakers, the CEO of Columbus Council on World Affairs, Patrick Terrian, our ample moderator today, and the most gracious and charming Ambassador Sarna. You have an open invitation to come back to Columbus anytime. So thank you all, and thank you all for being here.